Welcome to this week's Religion Media Centre briefing, which is on the 50th anniversary of BBC Radio 4's The Sunday programme. There's a book that's coming out this week charting its history, with conversations listed around the headlines covered during that period, simply called Sunday, written by Ed Stourton, a current presenter on the programme, and Amanda Hancox, who's been associated for many years with it as a producer and editor. Unfortunately, Ed can't be with us today because he has to present The World at One, with the regular presenters having been sent out to the Middle East to cover the story there. But we are very pleased to be joined by Amanda. So thank you, Amanda, for joining us. I know actually the book is the lion's share of the product of your research on the programme. Take us back to the beginning then in 1970. What was the intention of starting the Sunday programme then?
Well, I'll just take you back even further, so just to provide a bit of context. So when Reith set up the British Broadcasting Company, which then became the corporation in the 1920s, religious broadcasting was very much part and parcel of the original feast of programs that they had. So it was very much religion, light entertainment, certain amount of news, drama, those sort of things, because he was very religious himself, and he had very set views on what he thought religious broadcasting should be about. And so essentially it was to do with worship programs. I mean, they were very bold. They went out all over the country, lots of OBs everywhere, and it was reflective talks. And that really sort of set us for religious broadcasting. And it set the scene for religious broadcasting for the next effectively 40 years, because when you get back onto the 1960s, religion was very largely worship programs and talks. And obviously there have been some amazing talks, like C.S. Lewis had done various things, all sorts of famous writers and people have done stuff, but essentially it was that sort of type of programming. And obviously presenters had changed and tone had changed and different things were happening, but it was essentially worship and talks. So Colin Semper, who was then a producer in the department, who later became head of the department, he realized that religion was actually sort of becoming a bit of a ghetto in terms of what it was about, and the perception of it was very much it was worship. So he was very keen to pull it out of that and put it into a sort of current affairs setting. So that's how the Sunday programme started, and I think we started the same year as the Today programme, I think, or pretty close to it anyway. So then the idea was that, religion doesn't have to be just about worship. Religion affects people's lives in so many different ways, and the Sunday programme was one way of looking at it. So our remit right from the very start was all about reporting on the big religious issues, but also providing moral and ethical and religious perspectives on the news of the day.
Thank you, Amanda. And we're joined on this call today by many presenters and producers and reporters who've worked on the programme over the decades. And we're going to go through some of the highlights of the stories that were covered and the way that they were covered. So if I could bring you in one by one. We have Mike Wooldridge with us, former religious affairs correspondent, Alison Hilliard, former presenter of the programme, with Trevor Barnes. I think, Trevor, you're probably the one longest serving reporters on this call. Emily Buchanan, also a former religious affairs correspondent and presenter of the show. Christopher Landau, another former correspondent, now a clergyman in the Church of England. And we have Ellie McCain, former producer with the Sunday programme, and Tim Maby, a reporter from the 1970s. Have I missed anyone out? I think that's everyone, isn't it? So thank you all very much for joining. And in the preamble to this show, everyone was talking non-stop and over each other, which is how we used to do meetings, as I remember, and probably how this briefing is going to progress. So we'll start with the topics, and I know we've got people who are going to lead off on the topics, and do chip in your observations and anecdotes as we go. I think, Mike, I'm going to start with you, if I may. So the book makes it clear that the Sunday programme, it charts the topics that were covered under 19 titles. We're not going to get through all 19, but it does specifically say that it wasn't just about reporting the Church of England and domestic religious issues. It was about a global take on religious stories around the world. And that was very much your beat, wasn't it? You were, before you were the religious affairs correspondent, you were a correspondent in South Africa, South Asia, and then also a world affairs correspondent. Can you take us through some of the highlights of your reports as you remember them for the Sunday programme? I don't know if you'd like to start with the period in South Africa, which you said when we were talking earlier were highlighted to you, brought back memories as you went through the book.
Yes, certainly did. I first sort of became involved in reporting on South Africa before I became religious affairs correspondent. I was there initially as East Africa correspondent, traveling down frequently to Johannesburg and other parts of South Africa throughout the 1980s, really, and becoming involved in the coverage as the opposition to apartheid intensified, particularly on the grounds in the Black townships. Protests grew, more and more clashes with the security forces. It was becoming an ever bigger news story. So that was my first period of regular involvement with it. And in the course of that, sometimes that did indeed involve reporting for the Sunday programme, not least because religion, in the shape of religious figures, playing a part in usually the protests against apartheid, the institutionalized racial segregation of that area, because they were so prominent in the protests. You would very often see Archbishop Desmond Tutu in particular, but also people like Frank Chikane and Alan Boesak and Peter Story, the head of the Methodists, and a good number of other people actually in the front row of protest in many of the townships, and in that sense leading the confrontation with the security forces. Often very much trying to prevent those protests turning to violence. I remember Desmond Tutu frequently shouting out "Bopa," in the Zulu language, an appeal to people to kind of calm down, particularly hope to the security forces so they wouldn't start shooting people, but also youngsters to refrain from throwing stones as they would so often do. So there was a period then of reporting generally on of course, the township unrest, the politics of the era, but quite often this, I think, was of particular interest to the Sunday programme because of the church involvement in it. And it was on both sides. You had the Dutch Reformed Church, essentially, the majority of it standing with the government, the white government of the day, with the exception of a few very famous figures like Beyers Naudé, for example, who become very much a leader of the protesters. A strong story, a story that grew in its importance, the religious dimension of this, throughout the time, until I became, at the beginning of 1989, the Southern Africa correspondent based then in Johannesburg, and so day to day covering all the events. And of course, that really was a turning point at that time. That's when P.W. Botha finally resigned, handed over to F.W. de Klerk as the leader of the white government, who pretty swiftly then called what turned out to be the last white elections. A few months later comes de Klerk's famous unbanning of the ANC and all the other opposition parties and groups, and then just a couple of weeks later, the release of Nelson Mandela. So I was covering all those events, of course, as then the correspondent for South Africa, not only for all the rest of the BBC, radio and quite often television as well, but also regularly then for the Sunday programme. So that really got into it. And indeed, I was there for the rest of 1990 as well, after Mandela had been released, the beginning of the negotiations, when the violence by no means stopped, continued to be a very tense period. And it was about then, as I look at the screen, when I think we had as far as I remember, a Sunday away day, if you like. We had a Sunday moving to South Africa. Was it for the World Council of Churches visit, Alison?
No,
and Trevor, were you there too?
Yes, Trevor and I were both there.
Yes.
Hello, Mike. Lovely to see you.
I was there at that time, and then on to eventually to the first non-white elections.
I remember that very well, Mike. In fact, Trevor and I went out and were joined by you. And I think it was to mark the first election in 1994, the first election that basically brought about really symbolically marked the end of apartheid, because that was the election of the government that Nelson Mandela headed, and it was the first non-racial election. I remember you very powerfully reporting from those election results, and going into the townships. Trevor and I spent a lot of time with Christine Morgan, who came out as a producer, who just to report on the everyday violence that was still continuing, but the momentous changes that had taken place. And I remember doing an interview with Desmond Tutu and Alan Boussac, as you say, and just powerful testimonies of standing by that apartheid struggle, and seeing momentous change in the country. And Mike, you had very personal memories to share at that time too, I remember, from your reporting there.
They've been so involved with the forces of opposition to apartheid, so they came down and had a big kind of celebration of the change, the transformation that was unraveling then. And I do remember, and this is involves some lighter moments perhaps, but there was a huge celebration in Cape Town in a stadium there, which was presided over by Archbishop Tutu, and he preached and he danced, of course. And I remember that I was contributing a lot to a Sunday program that was actually coming out from London. You were right at that time. So sort of sharing in the presentation and describing what was going on around, and doing it all as we did in those days, or at least as I carried on doing when others had moved on technologically, but still through my ewer and a tiny little, we just got the first, I think they were called the M4s, the satellite phones. So a pretty, a wire reaching out from my ewer at the back of this, inside this stadium, to where the satellite was outside. And the wire only just stretched to my ewer and threatened to break and cut me off at any moment. So desperately trying to cling to this thing and keep the broadcast going. Probably couldn't hear a word any of you were saying at the other end, but trying to feed into that with a description of that particular extraordinary meeting.
Can I say there was one moment when we kind of overlapped. We hadn't met in person, Mike, but I'd been sent to the Soviet Union as was, and to report on anti-Semitism. And I happened to be in Moldavia, as it was then, and got wind of a story about the local priest, the Orthodox priest, being involved in the first free elections. So I went along, sort of introduced myself, and he said, "Do you want to come to the rally?" So I was up there with a ringside seat of 1 million Moldavians, first free elections ever, and I was next to this priest. And I phoned the story in, and I thought, I'm going to get the Pulitzer next, just you wait. And then they said it was actually the 11th of Feb 1990, and I just heard the words, "Sorry, Mandela's just been released," and it was wall to wall Mike Wooldridge after that.
Well, I mean, the programme did go to many countries around the world, didn't it? I'm sure you've all got stories from different countries. But I'd like to just pick you up, Alison, now, because although you're not a BBC reporter anymore, you are still specialising in issues of faith worldwide. So you're the senior programme director for Wilton Park, a place of global dialogue funded by the FCDO in the UK. And your memory, you were telling me earlier, was connected to stories about Israel and Palestine, which you visited, reported from, presented from. Can you tell us some of the headline stories that you remember from your period?
I remember giving the then producer of the programme, David Coombs, complete periods of nightmare, I think, actually. I was dispatched off to interview Yasser Arafat, I remember. And goodness, when you think of change times, that would have been 1992 or 93. And I went to Tunis to interview him in a safe house. As you know, at that time, he was under threat of Israeli assassination. So he never spent much of the same week in the same house, let alone the same night in the same house. And I remember being taken blindfolded around Tunis to a safe house to interview him. But it was at that remarkable time of interviewing him around the time of the peace process. So it was the early days of Oslo, before 1993. and interviewing him about the role of holy places, the role of Jerusalem. He had recently married a young Palestinian Christian woman, so the role of Christians in the Holy Land came up in the interview too. But that was just an extraordinary time of hope, to think that as the Sunday programme, interviewing him and then following him as he returned to Gaza in 1994 and interviewing the local Palestinian Christians in Gaza. I remember clearly at that time, at a time of really believing that, sworn enemies could make peace, and that there was a time of compromise, and the Palestinian-Israeli situation could be addressed in some way. But even, one of my most vivid memories from Hezbollah, and this was again an interview that you wouldn't even get today, let alone be able to do today, was going to Beirut to interview the head of Hezbollah, who'd just been recently elected, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, about, then it was newly formed, he was the newly elected leader. He had just brought his party to take part in the first elections in Lebanon, and they were very much wooing the Lebanese population by offering education, offering food, offering practical assistance. So it was looking at that whole social wing of Hezbollah and about what would become an increasing role in Lebanese politics, but right at the very beginning of that Hezbollah connection. And, listening to last week's programme, for example, some things haven't changed, have they? So that peace dividend of 93, 94 has led nowhere. There's still the sense of the holy places being central to the issue. The issue of Jerusalem has still not been resolved and was still there in those early interviews. But, Hezbollah and Hamas was only in its infancy at that stage. And Hezbollah, I think of the piece on last week Sunday of trying to unpack the demands of the demands of Islamists. Very changed times. ISIS obviously wasn't mentioned, and that very radical nature of an Islamist demand was nowhere to be seen, really. So changed times, and in pre-9/11 changed times, but so much that has not changed on the ground in the reporting of that story. So I went back many times for Sunday to present programs from Jerusalem, from Bethlehem, from Gaza, from Lebanon, and so on. But the religious dimension of that story, unthinkable to have had the fault lines in Israeli society that Sunday's been reporting on for the last year, exposed at that time. But so much has changed and so little has changed, and so little from that sort of heady days of looking at a possible new Middle East.
Thank you, Alison. Mike, do you have recollections of covering the Israel-Palestine story when you were a World Affairs correspondent?
I do, and occasionally from Jerusalem, and indeed up from the Lebanon border as well, while I was a World Affairs correspondent, you're right. And probably from time to time contributing to Sunday's coverage during that time as well. And would absolutely share what you've just said, Alison. I mean, it has been the most desperate time, hasn't it, this past week, and the possibility of so much further fragmentation. And the kind of exploration that Sunday does is absolutely essential for listeners, I think. Too much programming does not even consider the religious dimension of so many crises and conflicts, and even more hopeful situations around the world. Essential to do so, and always, but never more than at this time.
Staying with you, Alison, and slightly changing gear, you said that one of your main memories of reporting for Sunday was from Northern Ireland, which is how your story began as a reporter for Sunday. Just tell us about that, your story, and the stories that you covered at the very start.
I suppose I started working for Sunday when I presented its sister programme in Northern Ireland called Sunday Sequence. And, at that time in the 80s, came from a background where religion was everything. Religion was your school, religion was your community, religion was your politics, religion was your friend, and religion was your enemy. And so I very much came to Sunday with that background of not seeing religion as or religious programming as something to be compartmentalized, not in any sense seeing it as something where you just discussed women priests and issues of sexuality and the Anglican communion, but seeing it as central to why people made the decisions that they made and why they did the things that they did. And very much coming to Sunday. And I remember one Sunday we brought back to Belfast. I was presenting Sunday at the time, but going back to Belfast, and that would have been in the early 90s, talking about the role that religious leaders had played in the peace process, and interviewing Gerry Adams, I remember. I don't think we got much out of this interview, but asking him about the whole issue of forgiveness, asking him in the light of Gordon Wilson, whose daughter Marie had died in the Enniskillen bombing, what he made of the issue of forgiveness. But, you know, he was talking about the role of Catholic priests like Father Alex Reid and the role that priests had in Clonard Monastery, the role that they had played in helping him shape his vision of peace. And again, in that story too, there was sort of some sense that religious leaders were coming together to push that peace, to push it behind the scenes in talks with paramilitaries, to push it externally in talks with politicians. We had Tony Blair talking openly to Ian Paisley about the Bible, many interviews for Sunday with Ian Paisley. So contrasting really how religion on the one hand was pushing a sectarian division, and religion was promoting reconciliation on the other. And of course, that has been the bread and butter of Sunday, to look at how both of those things can happen, both towards peacemaking and towards conflict.
How much a part of the Northern Ireland story, the island story, is religion these days? I'm wondering if Emily or Amanda may like to kind of come in on that.
We did a chapter about abuse in the church, which we centred on Ireland, just because it was a sort of story arc in a way, that we could sort of go from the beginning to the end. I mean, obviously, loads of denominations trying to sort of find a way through it. We centred on Ireland, and I think it also tells another story about the relationship between the church and the government in the Republic, and how, as revelations started to come out about what really went on and the cover-ups that went on and the collusions that happened between the church and the government, thing really imploded, when you got the Ryan report and the Murphy report, all these sort of things. And then you get the stories about the Magdalene laundries, and Sunday sort of charted its way all the way through that with, you know, the various different Irish reporters who were covering the story at the time, and also interviews with survivors of abuse and various things like that. And I think it's really interesting just seeing how quickly things have changed in Ireland, because once the government, you know, really tried to push away from the church, and then suddenly you get, you know, abortion opening up, you get same-sex marriages happening, you know, church attendance in Ireland just completely plummeted. And in a way, the church is sort of trying to pick up the pieces there. And it's a very sad story about what happened. But I think the thing that sort of shocked me really was just how quickly the country changed in its attitude towards the church there. And how, you know, there are many people who were very devout Catholics who will never ever go in another church again. I mean, there are sort of signs of revival and stuff going on, but it was massively damaging.
I think that's really true, Amanda, except I think that there was a unique dimension from what happened in Northern Ireland with the Troubles, as opposed to what happened with the change that you've just rightly outlined. I was talking to Archbishop Eamon Martin a few weeks ago, and he was talking about, well, both archbishops of Armagh, both the Catholic and the Protestant archbishops, talk about this kind of vacuum that there seems to be at the moment, this kind of hopelessness there seems to be at the moment, this lack of dividend of the peace process, with a kind of generational memory that has forgotten that there's no longer violence or no longer killings on the same scale. But that vacuum and hopelessness with the peace process that seems to, after 25 years, have gone into stalemate, that peace walls are still up, that communities are still divided and schools are still divided. And I think it's really interesting to just chart what the role of religious leaders is in Northern Ireland today, and where that has gone in a non-existent dormant, a non-existent political process. So I think it's a very complex story in Ireland, is it? But one that Sunday has returned to time and time again.
Thank you. Another story that it's returned to time and time again is the coverage of Islam. And Christopher Landau, you were a correspondent for the World Service in the 90s. I wonder if you could just explain or describe your feelings, your reflections on that period in history.
I think as someone who was always formally employed as a mainstream journalist within the newsroom, but then worked for Sunday as well, and indeed I will always be very grateful to Amanda for taking a punt on this newly emerged BBC News trainee with very little track record, but a theology degree, and she took the risk. But I think the reason I was taken on within the newsroom was that so many journalists didn't know the difference between an archdeacon and an archbishop, and had no clue really how to distinguish within the life of the church, and someone who did, might have half a chance of helping navigate some of the coverage. But the absolutely chronic lack of understanding of Islam was one of the things that just kept coming up time after time. It meant latterly, job interviews that I went to at the BBC would always involve a question about, do you know the difference between Sunni and Shia, for example? But what you were recognizing was that within the audience, often that recognition wasn't there. And I think what I would say is that Sunday, to me, has always been this place that you knew you could turn for some intelligent analysis of these issues, even if, as a correspondent, sometimes you had your head in your hand when you heard how other outlets across the BBC might be dealing with it. And of course, I look at the people on this call, and, you're the names that I kind of, listen to as I thought, gosh, I would never join that group of people. And certainly I think by the time Amanda took me on, the thought of flying out a presenter and a reporter to South Africa was long gone. But within the context of the huge budgetary problems the BBC has faced, and of course the sidelining of religion in many ways, the dismantling of the TV department relative to what's still possible on radio, actually Sunday has consistently kept its place in the schedule. That people are still listening and engaging. And I think it's been a place where, even as the BBC's wider ability to cover religion well has ebbed and flowed, shall we say, euphemistically, actually you've known that you can turn to Sunday and find something authoritative. And, it's a great sadness to me that so often across the wider BBC, religion has been marginalised. But Sunday really has been a constant. And I think for that to be a consistent place of expertise within the life of the BBC is so significant. And I always think that there's a Sunday story, if you like, which probably, today in the World at One or whatever wouldn't touch, and otherwise would only be big news within the niche of a particular faith perspective, within Jewish news or, on the Church Times or whatever. But Sunday will often bring that to a wider audience and actually help people realise, no, this is significant. And when you look at the events of the last week, my goodness, we desperately need a better understanding of religion, whether you're trying to approach it impartially or whether you've, saddled yourself to a particular faith in the way that I now have,
There was one particular story that you were famous for, Christopher, which was the interview with Rowan Williams and his comments on Sharia law. Do you want to take us back to that moment?
Well, I mean, sadly, I had moved on from Sunday largely at this point, but only because I suppose I'd done enough half-decent things on Sunday that I got a reporter role on The World at 1 p.m. And fascinatingly, was approached by Lambeth Palace, what they thought would be a damage limitation exercise in relation to the Archbishop making what they knew would be a controversial intervention. But frankly, they were worried about how the newspapers would write it up. And so they thought a fairer interview on the BBC would be better. I stand by the fact that I did a fair interview, but, by 5 o'clock that day, Downing Street, the opposition, and various other figures had distanced themselves in no uncertain terms from the Archbishop's comments. And yes, it was a kind of slightly infamous moment for me. And I certainly was offered the job at the World Service as religion correspondent off the back of it, I think. But it was absolutely a story that demonstrated the chronic lack of understanding of Islam, including among programme editors at the BBC. There were some pretty embarrassing people invited on to speak on behalf of Islam, at that time. And this recognition that the kind of level of understanding of who might speak, at least for a significant portion of the Muslim community, so many programme editors and producers just had absolutely no sense of that, in a way in which they wouldn't be permitted to if it was economic affairs. And possibly they wouldn't make the same mistakes about the church either. But I think it touched a nerve in terms of attitudes towards Islam within the wider public as well.
Just remind us what the story actually was. What did he say in the interview?
So he said that he felt, for reasons of community cohesion, aspects of Sharia law should be incorporated into British law to enable British Muslims to be able to integrate successfully. And of course, when you look at the situation, for example, facing a Muslim woman in a polygamous marriage, which is not recognised then in British law, you could see that there were real social problems that he was seeking to speak into. Now, whether it's the place of the Archbishop of Canterbury to promote that kind of reform is one question. And if you are going to make that kind of highly controversial intervention, it might be helpful to have lined up, for example, all of your interfaith contacts to support you in public once you've made the statement. And the astonishing thing I realised was that at the point that that interview was broadcast on The World at 1, there were about 3 people who'd read the speech in full, and I was one of them, and his head of comms was the other, and pretty much no one else had. So it was a very revealing, astonishing moment. But of course, Sunday, and you'll see in the book, the way in which Roger Bolton and others, led some really very, very detailed analysis of what had been said, what the response was, the kind of level of engagement that you really need on that kind of story, in which I still think Sunday is just fantastic for providing.
The story of British Islam has just is transformative, isn't it? In those 50 years, Amanda, I think you've got a statistic in your book where you describe the number of Muslims who were living in Britain in 1970 when the programme began, to the situation now where there are many Muslims, many different denominations, many different groups, and still this lack of understanding that Christopher's just been talking about. Can I just ask you to reflect, or perhaps bring Trevor in on this as well, the picture of British Islam that's emerged in that period, as the number of Muslims has grown in this country, and the way British Islam has developed and formed and found its own voice in that period? Would any of you like to comment on that?
I think one of the interesting things when I was researching the book and just looking back at how we'd covered Islam back in the 1970s, because then the programme was predominantly about Christianity, but we did introduce other ideas, and it was much more about looking at religion in a sort of more educational way. You know, this is a mosque, this is what people do, you know, and there were certain issues which we covered, like there's a very early interview with an educationalist talking about separation of girls and boys, you know, for doing PE and things like that, and that was a big concern within the community. But to be honest, we didn't really cover Islam that much in the early years. Judaism was the religion that we tended to go for, and I don't know whether that was because we had better links in that way. But then when you had things like the Salman Rushdie affair, which happened over his book, and suddenly people were in the streets and they were burning, you know, books and stuff like that. I mean, that was a real sort of wake-up call, I think, to a lot of people in the country about, oh, hang on, what's going on here? And people started to see Islam in a slightly different sort of way. And then I think the big thing, which in a way Islam in this country hasn't really quite recovered from, was 9/11. I mean, that was such a massive thing that happened, and it just totally changed people's perception of Islam. I remember talking to an actor last year who was Muslim, and he was saying that he was quite, you know, he said, oh, you know, before 9/11, I was seen as some sort of slightly exotic person that they might have on, you know, as part of a cast in a television drama or something like that. Once 9/11 happened, he didn't get any work for ages. Every time he went for something, people would think he might be a terrorist, you know, that there would be something dodgy about him, that he would be supporting ISIS or Al Qaeda or something like that. And I mean, I don't know what Emily thinks about all of this, but it just totally changed reporting. I remember talking to Caroline Wyatt recently, and she was saying, she said, after 9/11, all I did was report on war. I reported on war and violence and about terrorism. And all the time, Muslims were having to justify why they weren't a terrorist, you know, and there was this knee-jerk reaction from people about Muslims. And I don't think we've quite got beyond that yet. You know, every time something happens, like a violent act somewhere, you know, everybody immediately thinks it must be a terrorist something that's happened. I don't know quite, you know, and I feel sorry for people in the Muslim community because they're having to keep, you know, saying, you know, I don't believe in this, I don't associate myself with this is not what Islam's about, and all the time. And I think Sunday had a big role in terms of trying to explain. And I remember when the Bataclan, that horrible, you know, thing happened when those terrorists went into that concert hall in Paris and started shooting everybody and stuff like that. And then we were on air, I think the day after or 2 days later or something. And, you know, we talked to lots of priests and people, you know, from French churches in London and all the rest of it. But then we had this big discussion about what is IS theology, because they came out with this big statement and trying to unpack it and trying to explain to people, you know, this is a corruption of Islam, this is a particular thing, you know, and, you know, it still goes on today, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so interesting because I started, you know, my first sort of big Muslim story, as it were. It wasn't for Sunday, but it was for the BBC Two assignment programme. And I did quite a lot on Algeria, and that when they had their elections, and one of the parties that won was the Islamic Party. So I spent, you know, a lot of time with these sort of fundamentalists who at that time, a lot of them, they're sort of the people they admired were based in Bradford, and, you know, the English were the sort of heroes because we seemed to be sort of looking after them, and they didn't like the French. But through that, I've really got to understand a lot more about how these movements sort of come up, you know, what they were protesting about and why they're there. And I think the problem has really developed because of these huge atrocities like 9/11 and then 7/7 is that people, they almost don't want to know why they're there or what the context is. It's just bad, it's evil, and they should all be condemned. And I think, you know, thank goodness for Sunday. And it's always a battle with news, actually, to break the stereotype of you know, oh, they're all terrible. And they all just want to destroy everything, because the nuances are huge, and it's a tiny minority who will believe in that. And there's always a reason, you know, someone doesn't wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to be a terrorist. You know, it's sort of, there are all these roots to it and these ideas and all of that. And I think that's where Sunday is so important. And I've had to battle, you know, when I've done stories in the newsroom at the BBC, and they've, you know, maybe it's been about Sharia law or about some subtlety, or that, you know, there are certain things that are, you know, not all bad, as it were, and editors just can't understand. Something's either really bad or it's good, and it's the same in so many conflicts, isn't it? It's how news covers things. One side's good, the other side's bad, and we're very bad at holding two thoughts in our head, that there's nuance on both sides.
I think that's the whole issue, really. I think that news, one element of news is conflict and controversy, and we like nothing better than a row. And of course, within religion, there have been lots of rows, internal rows, all the better, whether it's about women priests, women bishops, whether it's the churches challenging apartheid in South Africa or communism in the Soviet bloc, whether it's solidarity in the Vatican and helping this, that, and the other, whether it's, faith in the city and people and the church complaining against certain aspects of the Tory government at the time, the miners' strike. They're all the kinds of things that we report on, first of all, as news. But I think where Sunday was able to score is it reported the news and then it reported the analysis afterwards. And there was an excellent piece this week, for example, I thought, with the Muslim chap, I've forgotten his name, who was unpacking Hamas. How reflective they were of ordinary Gazan civilians. I mean, coming back to you, Alison, when we were fortunate having Alison in those days of the back channel agreements and negotiations that were just coming to the surface, she had the contacts. So whenever she got a whiff or a tip off or a suspicion of a story, she could put it to the then editor, and we would run with it, and it would be reported as a story, but then dissected afterwards, and more time would be spent on it than perhaps on the Today programme.
Trevor, give us some examples then. Great rows within the Church of England you've covered in your time, recurring rows.
Well, within the church, I suppose it was women bishops, women priests. It was pretty much a male-dominated clergy when I joined. There were small movements. I remember interviewing Florence Lee Tim Oy, the very first woman priest, but she was very much an outrider under specific conditions that were quite pertinent to where she was at the time, but weren't really relevant. There were kind of lone voices. I think the movement for the ordination of women did exist then, but it was a small voice. And then, of course, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it became one of the dominant things. Sexuality, another one of the big issues that divided the church, and where there was a conflict, there was always a story. It's quite interesting, though, that what we've not mentioned, and I think this is testimony to how important the programme is I mentioned their sexuality. Peter Tatchell was a great friend of the programme. Not, as I understand it, a Christian believer, I think a humanist in outlook, but he was a great friend of the programme, and he used to take part in it. I interviewed him countless times. Ditto figure Ludovic Kennedy, won't mean very much to lots of you now, but Richard Dawkins will, or Claire Rayner, all of them atheists, humanists, Polly Toynbee, they all took Sunday seriously, and they entered into debate with clerics who they wouldn't normally have mixed with, and had a view, and the views were politely but intelligently put. And if you're interested in religion, it was an interesting program. And when I started in the 80s, we've not mentioned him actually, and I think he does deserve a mention. There was a chap called John Newbury, and he was the first person to hire me. In many ways, he was a journalist manqué, and he was a Methodist minister, but he wanted to make the programme something that would get itself on the news when the programme ended, and frequently he did. And then I think we were helped by people like Gerald Priestland, who'd established a solid role in foreign correspondent coverage, doing religion, doing his series on Priestland's Progress. And he was a friend of the programme. We were then followed by distinguished journalists like Mike and Ruth Rosemary Harthill, who just developed the journalism alongside a real and we were trusted. I think above all, we were trusted. People trusted Alison with their secrets, as it were. They weren't quite secrets because they knew they would probably get out. That was the point of it. But they knew they would get a fair hearing with them.
Gerald Priestland, in his book autobiography, said about Sunday, about it, how the staff on Sunday and in the religious department in general sort of moved from clergy who were interested in broadcasting to broadcasters who were interested in religion. And I think that was very telling and very true about what happened to the department over the years, I think, and made such a difference, I think, in terms of journalism and the Sunday programme.
Newbury said to me when he first hired me, gave me my first chance, and Christopher, we all remember those first chances. They're very important. And he said, rather like a sports reporter doesn't have to be able to play for Chelsea or even to be in Sunday League, but he or she has to be interested in football. Well, that automatically ruled me out as any sports reporter, but I did have an interest in religion. And if you were interested, and if you did the work, and if you did the journalistic reporting, then that was all you did. You didn't have to do a faith test to see whether you believed in this. In fact, we've had people who didn't believe a word of it, but the issue was very interesting.
And also, I think there's a certain tone that he set, which was carried on by David Coombs and other people. Yeah, and absolutely. John actually was somebody who employed me as well, and I came in as a researcher. And I had actually got a degree in theology, but I'd gone off and done lots of other things, joined the BBC in other departments. And there was a perception about the religious department that everybody were clerics and they all went around singing hymns, which of course is ridiculous, but that's the sort of general view that people had. So a slight intrepidation when I saw there was a 6-month attachment in religion. I was thinking, God, I've been to university, I've done all this, I've never done anything with it, I ought to apply. So I applied and I sort of got this attachment. The first day I arrived, I thought, God, is it going to be like, is everybody going to be going around singing hymns? And John walked into the office and he had a sheriff's badge on. And I just sort of looked at him and I just thought, I'm going to be fine. And actually, in the years that, I worked on the programme on and off and everything for a number of years and everything, I think there was also, we covered, really serious stuff. We also covered lots of light stuff and great stories, but there was all this sense of fun as well. There was all this sort of sense of camaraderie and, it was a real joy to be on the programme, that you were doing difficult stuff, but at the end of the day, you all came together on a Friday night. We used to go to this wine bar, didn't we? Which is where we had our meeting where everybody came back after they'd been out reporting and stuff like that. And there was this real sense of a sort of team effort and everybody trying to do their best to report religion in the best way they could, but with a sense of, this is a really good thing that we're doing.
What I think Sunday at its best does very well is to, and in a distinctive way really amongst programs, is that it explores people's experience of religion and the nature of religious conviction, which are extremely important to look at because it underpins of so much of what happens in life. But the point about Sunday is that it does it in a way that's not only seeking to understand it and explain it, explore it, but also to challenge it, where it's important to do that. And it's not just necessarily generally a failure to do that across the rest of the BBC, but also across the rest of the media in many ways. And I do think that's something it's often a reason to do that and should go on doing it if you're looking at all for any thoughts on the future of the programme.
I think also it's worth saying, that there were light moments in the programme, and it was quite nice because, we used to do specials on religion and the arts and this, that and the other, and there was always a sense of humour that would come out sometimes in items. I remember once we did something, there was something in the news about Sikhs wearing beards or something, and some big argument had sort of sprung up in the Sikh community about something to do with this, and we got some guy who came in who was at the University of Leeds. He was a lecturer there, he was Sikh, and he was sort of like a friend of the programme. And he came in and said, can you come in and can you talk to us about beards? Why do Sikhs have beards? And then we were sat there thinking, how can we do this interview in a really interesting way, you know? So I said to him, how long does it take you to do your turban in the morning? And he said, oh, about 4 minutes. And I thought, that is the length of this item. So I said to him, could you just do the interview while you're putting your turban on? So he went, yeah, all right. So he did the whole interview with Ed looking slightly bemused doing the interview as he put his turban on.
Well, Christopher, you made the point that this is radio after all. And although there may not be so many reporters on the programme now, one thing that made it live was the reports that you all did when you were out on the road.
Yes, I mean, I think actually Sunday has maintained the place for the crafted radio feature. I mean, I learned a lot just listening to what Trevor was doing on the weeks that I wasn't being, employed, for example. But I remember once being dispatched to a woman who was making Lent stew and doing a kind of cookery item. But this Lent stew was so disgusting. I completely lost it as we were recording this. And I think it's the only time that, pre-recorded sort of uncontrolled giggles from a reporter have been broadcast, because Carmel Lonergan just sort of thought this was so hysterically funny. And I can say that the Lent stew was utterly inedible.
The stories we've just heard there really just fulfill the Reithian pledge: information, education, and entertainment.
I'm going to bring in Tim Maby at this point, because Tim was a reporter in the 1970s, in the very first decade, and that's what you remember doing, Tim. You don't remember any of the office politics or the big discussions about issues of the day. What you remember is the stories.
Yes, I mean, my job was very much more silly than all you've been involved in, because we were right at the beginning. I heard the programme. I was a young freelance. It just started, and I rang up David Winter and started offering him pictures of religious life in Wales. I would do the pilgrim trail to Bardsey Island, the island of the saints at the top end of North Wales, or discovered that there was a wonderful ancient form of music still being used in mid Wales called plugine, which sounded almost medieval in its way. And the one that my wife particularly remembers and likes is the time that there'd been a spate of churches being ransacked for their goods and chattels in Italy. And David asked me to see if I could find a church in Wales that had something that might be equally valuable. So I found a little village near Monmouth called Skenfrith, and it had a wonderful 13th century cope. And I went there and pretended to cut the glass covering it and taking out all the beautiful piece of surplice with all its inlaid gold weaves and that sort of thing. And then I went off to find the vicar, who was, interestingly enough, tending goats in his churchyard. And I went up to him and I put all on tape, said to him, I'm afraid I've just stolen the Skenfrith cope. And he said, oh dear. That was my sort of contribution to the programme, I'm afraid.
Those were the days. And we haven't really talked in any great depth about the skirmishes that the Sunday programme had with the bishops over the years, with its reporting of the Church of England, over women, as has been discussed, but over all the other issues: faith in the city, the meetings between Thatcher and the bishops, the trouble that Runcie got into with the Falklands. Amanda, just talking to you about the times when it was tricky for the Sunday programme to speak truth to power, to report on the Church of England. What were the hot disputes that took place between the Church of England and the Sunday programme, and how tricky was it for it to hold a line as an observer of the Church of England rather than a participant in it?
It was difficult, and to a large extent it sort of depended on who was in the press office at the time of the different organisations. There were times when Lambeth Palace and Church House weren't really communicating with each other, and it was quite difficult. And also, I think because Sunday was a programme that right from the start had wanted to ask critical questions, not judgmental questions, but just to try and get to the bottom of everything, to try and unpack what was going on, all the rest of it. And by and large, your bishops, your archbishops, religious leaders just weren't used to being questioned. on what they had to say and having to account for what they were doing. And so this was, you know, potentially quite a problem. You always used to find with archbishops that you probably got one shot at an interview with an archbishop in the early days, like an Archbishop of Canterbury, because they come in thinking it's going to be a cozy chat and they'd just taken up the job and all the rest of it. And then they would have an interview and they would be picked up on this and that and everything else. And you could see them coming out looking a bit shocked. And then you were very lucky if you got another interview with them again afterwards. I mean, the exceptions to that was Rowan Williams, who was a supporter of the programme, and he would when he was able to come on the programme. And actually Justin Welby has been on more than once, which is good. But I think you used to have this cat and mouse game that we used to play where certainly in the sort of 90s and into the 2000s, where a press release would be issued, a bishop would make a statement about something, you know, good story. It would be issued on a Friday afternoon, and then suddenly you would find when you were trying to get an interview that that person had gone away for the weekend, or nobody was available to comment. And so you did end up having a cat and mouse game, trying to find people who would be willing to talk. And then there would be moments when, you know, the church just, you know, refused to cooperate.
That's the key question, really, how the Church of England and other churches have responded to this interrogation, and how they've upped their game or become more interested or more proficient at public relations now than they were. I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that. Christopher, perhaps?
Well, I suppose the landscape is changing so rapidly, isn't it? And social media, meaning that actually a tweet response to a particular issue can have the impact that previously only an appearance on the Sunday programme or whatever would have. And I think it's really interesting to see how the kind of existing media then respond and adapt to this changed circumstances. And you certainly see with senior religious figures, I think the whole range from remaining in the bunker and not doing any social media through to really quite a lot. And Justin Welby, I think, has been quite adventurous and open.
I mean, I think also in terms of dealing with the press, one of the things I say in the postscript of the book is also how dealing with other faith communities has changed over the years. Because in the early days, especially, you know, in a way where you've got Christianity, which is a very hierarchical religion. Obviously, in Judaism, they've sort of dealt with things in a different way, with having a chief rabbi, and now we have a senior rabbi for the Reform Judaism. But in the non-hierarchical religions like Sikhism and Islam and Judaism and Hinduism, it's really difficult, and it still is a problem today about who speaks for whom.
Just to see today that Justin Welby has done a joint statement, you know, at Lambeth Palace with Ibrahim Mogra as the kind of, you know, face of British Islam. But that's really because Ibrahim, you know, is a fantastic person and has been around for a long time. But, you know, but of course, I don't think that Rowan Williams or George Carey would have done that kind of press statement with the cameras outside Lambeth Palace. And so you see how the religious leaders themselves are kind of adapting and changing and being more confident, I think.
I wonder what you feel the future of the Sunday programme is in an age when non-religion is rising and Christian affiliation is declining. Does it have a place even for the next decade, let alone the next 50 years? I wonder if I could ask for your views on that. Go to you first, Mike, and then all of you can chip in if you have something to say.
I think you just put your finger on a real challenge in that. The way, for many people, as we know, they now would say they have an interest in a much broader kind of what they call spirituality, I guess, rather than any fixed and identifiable religion necessarily. And who on earth are going to be the spokespeople for that if we need to have them? And so the risk is that will make the established leaders of our faith now less relevant to many people, to many listeners. How are we going to both capture and report on, and if you need them, get opinions from a much more amorphous and broader spirituality. So I think that's a practical challenge, but I don't think that should stop anybody carrying on doing exactly what he's done at the moment. The scrutiny that it does provide of, as I said earlier, religious conviction and religious experience is something that really doesn't happen elsewhere and is extremely important. I wonder whether a format for expansion in a way would be to have the Today programme now has its Today debate, which gets a lot of attention and is often very good and goes way beyond whatever is in an individual programme. And I don't know whether there have ever been Sunday debates. Slight problem there with the name of it, I guess, if it's going to go out on a Tuesday or a Wednesday or a Thursday. But could the Sunday programme generate debate of what would generally be very different kind of subjects from the Today programme, but that would actually draw more attention to all that is done? I think it'd be good to try, think about how it might be done.
I also think, in some ways, I think Sunday is sort of more important now than it's ever been. The really big issue for news, which it's sort of getting to grips with all these different types of units that have been set up in the newsroom, which are trying to counter fake news and fake information. Where people get their information from is really difficult, because a lot of it's on social media. A lot of people treat young people treat the sort of established news with suspicion, and I think when you're talking about things like faith and the big issues like in the Middle East or wherever it happens to be, or Trump and the religious right and all these sort of things, I think one of the things that Sunday is really important for is actually providing that corrective. And so having these correctives, having these ways of sources that people can come back to and say, right, okay, well, actually, I can trust this. I know that what they're saying is right, I think is really important.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And thank you, everybody, for taking part, and look forward to our party together.